Meriden, Connecticut, 1970. A fire moves through a brick factory complex that once produced the most coveted shotguns America ever made. By then, almost nobody noticed. The building had already been emptied of its purpose decades earlier, handed off to a silverware company that used it for storage, then to a firm that made wood and metal novelties, then to nothing at all. The machines that once hand-fitted Parker shotguns were long gone. The craftsmen who knew how to fit them were scattered or dead. The name itself had already been sold, packed up, and moved to another state where it was quietly shelved. This was Parker Brothers. For roughly 70 years, its side-by-side shotguns were the guns of robber barons, movie stars, and champion shooters. Annie Oakley, Clark Gable, Ernest Hemingway. A single fine Parker can sell today for more than $90,000. It outlasted the Civil War market that created it, outclassed every American rival, and became shorthand for the finest gun a wealthy dynasty could own. But the real story isn't the fire, or even the depression. It's what happens when a company builds the most perfect version of a product imaginable, and the world quietly decides it no longer wants perfect. Because here is the strange part. Parker didn't lose because its guns got worse. It lost because they stayed perfect. The very thing that made a Parker untouchable, the hand-fitting, the craftsmanship, the refusal to cut a corner, is the exact thing that priced it out of existence. And by the time it was gone, the name had become more durable than the company, the factory, or the people who built it. To understand why that collapse is so strange, you have to go back to a moment when Parker wasn't a luxury at all. When it wasn't even a gun company. It started, like a lot of American industrial stories, with a war. Charles Parker was born in 1809 in Cheshire, Connecticut, the 11th of 12 children in a family with almost nothing. He worked as a farmhand as a teenager, then walked north to Meriden to make something of himself. By 1832, he had a small shop, and from that shop he built one of those sprawling 19th century industrial empires that made things nobody romanticizes: coffee mills, lamps, hardware, silverware, machine tools, useful things, profitable things. Parker was a manufacturer first and a gun maker not at all. He barely knew firearms. Then the Civil War broke out, and the war did what wars always do to industrial towns. It turned a hardware man into an arms contractor. Under a partnership usually remembered as Parker, Snow, Brooks and Company, Parker took Union contracts to produce military rifles. By most accounts, something on the order of 15,000 Springfield rifled muskets, plus a contract for repeating rifles and a related Meriden operation that turned out cavalry carbines. Parker didn't have the gun knowledge to do this himself, so he did the practical thing. He hired it. He brought in two gunsmith brothers, William and George Miller, to run the part of the business he didn't understand. For a few years, the contracts were good, and then the war ended. This is the part most people miss. The end of a war is not a soft landing for a company like this. It is a cliff. The government contracts vanished almost overnight. Demand collapsed, and Charles Parker was left standing in a factory full of expensive, specialized gun-making machinery that had exactly one problem. There was no longer a war to feed it. That idle machinery is the real origin of Parker Brothers. Not patriotism, not a love of fine guns. A factory that had tooled up for a war that was now over, and an owner who refused to let that investment sit dead. So the Parkers asked a colder question: what else could those machines build? The answer they landed on was the sporting shotgun, a gun they figured they could sell to a country pushing west, to farmers and hunters and anyone who needed a reliable double gun, Around 1867 and 1868, depending on which records you trust, Charles Parker brought his sons into the business, Wilbur, Charles, and Dexter, and the firm that would carry their name took shape. The first Parker shotgun appeared in 1868. It used what was called a lifter action, a small lever in front of the trigger guard that opened the breech. It was a competent gun. It was not yet a legend, but from the very beginning, Parker made a choice that defined everything that came after and quietly planted the seed of its own collapse. The parts were machined, but the guns were hand-assembled, hand-fitted, finished by skilled workers one at a time. Quality wasn't a marketing angle. It was the entire strategy. Parker decided it would win by being better, not cheaper. For a long time, that bet looked like genius. To stay ahead, Parker did what successful companies do. It bought talent. In 1880, the original lifter action was replaced with a cleaner top lever design, reworked by Charles A. King, a designer who had come from Smith & Wesson. King was the kind of hire that mattered. Within a few years, he gave Parker its first hammerless gun, around 1888 or 1889. It was a shotgun with the hammers tucked inside the action instead of perched on the outside, the cutting edge of shotgun design at the time. Then, in 1901, King and another Parker man, James Hayes, patented a selective automatic ejector system, the kind of refinement that separated a serious gun maker from a cheap one. Each of these advances did the same two things at once. It made the gun better, and it made the gun harder and more expensive to build. Every improvement added parts, added fitting, added hours of skilled labor. Parker wasn't drifting up market by accident. It was engineering itself, deliberately, into a corner where only the wealthy could follow. And Parker leaned into exactly that. The company built an entire identity around a grading system, a ladder of quality that ran from the plain working-grade guns at the bottom all the way up to the elaborately engraved showpieces at the top, the AAHE and the famous A1 Special. A cheap Parker and an expensive Parker could be mechanically similar and yet exist in completely different worlds, separated by the amount of human craftsmanship and ornamentation poured into them. The lower-grade guns even carried a borrowed nickname, Old Reliable, a label Parker picked up after the Sharps Company, which had used it, went under in 1876. There's an early irony in that. Parker took its budget brand name from a gun maker that had already failed. The grading system was brilliant business. It let one company sell to the farmer and the millionaire from the same catalog. The finest examples were engraved by master craftsmen. The celebrated engraver Gustav Jung is known to have embellished some Parker guns, and those top-grade pieces became objects of status, not just tools. A Parker stopped being something you used and became something you displayed, something that said who you were. But a luxury good has one permanent weakness. It depends on good times. The moment you tie your company's survival to what wealthy people are willing to spend on things they don't strictly need, you've quietly bolted your future to the health of the economy. In the good years, nobody notices the risk. The risk is still there. For now, though, the strategy was working spectacularly because Parker had become the gun of the famous. The names attached to Parker shotguns read like a roster of American celebrity. Annie Oakley and her husband, the marksman Frank Butler, were associated with Parkers, and the company's own order books capture a small, almost human moment in the relationship. In 1901, Butler bought a fine BH grade Parker, trading in another gun for it. Within days, he brought it back. Annie, it seems, preferred her old Parker to the new one, and the original was returned to her. It's a tiny story, but it tells you everything about the brand's place in the culture. The most famous shooter in the world had a favorite Parker, and she wasn't going to be talked out of it. Clark Gable owned Parkers. Hemingway's name became attached to the legend. The guns appeared at the Great Expositions, Philadelphia in 1876, Chicago in 1893, where American industry showed off to the world. Parker had done something most manufacturers only dream of. It had turned a product into a symbol. And that's the quiet trap inside this whole story. The symbol was becoming so strong, so detachable from the actual factory, that one day it would be able to survive without the factory at all. The myth was outgrowing the machine that made it. While Parker was busy perfecting the past, refining a centuries-old idea of two barrels set side by side, fitted by hand, sold to the elite, a completely different kind of gun was loading in the background, and it didn't care about beauty at all. Starting in the late 19th century, a new category of shotgun arrived in America. The repeater, first the pump action, most famously the Winchester Model 1897, which could hold around 6 shells, then the semi-automatic, John Browning's Auto 5, which appeared in 1905 and was also produced in the United States as the Remington Model 11, holding 5. These guns were not elegant. Next to a fine Parker, they looked crude, even ugly. But they offered the one thing a side-by-side never could. More shots, faster. A Hunter with a side-by-side had 2 barrels, 2 shots, and then a reload. A Hunter with a pump or an autoloader could fire 5 or 6 times before the man with the double had reloaded once. For a lot of Americans, farmers, working hunters, people who saw a shotgun as a tool rather than a treasure, that was the entire argument. The repeater simply did more. A repeater didn't have to be more beautiful than a Parker. It only had to be cheaper and faster, and it was both. That second word is the one that mattered most, and it's the one the romantics always skip. Repeaters weren't just better for high-volume shooting. They were dramatically easier and cheaper to mass produce. A pump gun could be stamped and machined and assembled in volume by less specialized labor at a fraction of the cost of a hand-fitted double. Parker's entire advantage, its skilled craftsmen, its painstaking assembly, its refusal to compromise, was, in pure manufacturing terms, a liability. Every hour of hand-fitting that made a Parker special also made it slow to build and expensive to sell. This is the contradiction at the center of the whole story. Parker's greatest strength and Parker's fatal weakness were the same thing. And here's what makes it tragic rather than simple. Parker's enemy wasn't a better side-by-side. The company could outbuild any rival double gun in America. Its enemy was an entirely different kind of weapon that made the side-by-side's virtues beside the point. You can't win a fight about craftsmanship when the customer has stopped caring about craftsmanship and started caring about firepower and price. This wasn't only Parker's problem either. The same pressure was about to crush an entire American industry. The great names of the American double gun, Fox, L.C. Smith, Lefevre, Parker, were all built on roughly the same idea, and they would all face the same reckoning in the same brutal window of history. When the category dies, the best company in the category dies with it. Being number one doesn't save you. It just means you fall from higher up. Parker, faced with this threat, did the most Parker thing imaginable. It didn't try to build a cheaper gun. It didn't pivot to repeaters. It looked at a market that was drifting towards speed and volume and price, and it responded by building something even finer. That instinct, to answer a crisis of economics with another act of craftsmanship, was about to become the trap that finished it. In the 1920s, As repeaters ate into the broad market, Parker refined its guns even further. It added a single trigger in 1922, a beaver tail forend in 1924, a ventilated rib in 1926, features that made the gun smoother, more modern, more desirable to the people who still cared about a fine double. And in the same stretch, Parker chased one of the most prestigious targets in the shotgun world, the tiny .410 bore, a small, delicate gauge, prized by collectors and skilled shooters. The story of that little gun captures the company perfectly. The first Parker .410 was prototyped in 1924 by a young member of the family, Charlie Parker Jr., reportedly while he was apprenticing in the works. He built it on a small 28-gauge frame, and the gun survives in the record as a specific object, serial number 190767. When it was shown off, the response was immediate. A Connecticut politician who saw it wanted one for himself and his friends. The .410 went into the catalog around 1926. Think about what that means. As the mass market was abandoning the side-by-side for cheap, fast repeaters, Parker's answer was to build an exquisite miniature shotgun for the people at the very top. It was innovation by prestige, not innovation by economics. And economics was the thing trying to kill it. Parker was climbing higher up the luxury ladder at exactly the moment the ladder was being pulled out from under the whole industry. Around this same time, in 1927, Parker did something that would matter later in a way nobody could have predicted. It acquired an ammunition maker, the Peters Cartridge Company. By at least one account, that ammunition business is a big part of why a much larger company would soon come hunting for Parker. The shotguns were the glory. The cartridge operation was the asset, because the wealthy buyers Parker had bet everything on were about to vanish. In 1929, the economy collapsed. The Great Depression did not arrive as a slow decline. It arrived as a detonation, and it went off directly underneath the one market Parker had spent 60 years building. A Parker had never been a poor man's gun, by most accounts. None of the company's shotguns ever retailed below around $50, which was serious money even in the boom years before the crash. In a depression, a hand-engraved luxury shotgun is one of the first things a buyer crosses off the list. You don't commission a fine double when you're worried about the rent. The exact craftsmanship that had justified Parker's prices for decades was now an unbearable cost. Hand-fitting is expensive, whether or not anyone is buying. The skilled workers still had to be paid. The slow, careful assembly still took the same number of hours. Parker was carrying the cost structure of a luxury house into a market that had no luxury left in it. And Parker was not alone in the wreckage. This is the moment the entire American side-by-side industry died, almost all at once. The great names folded or sold out in a tight, grim cluster. Fox had gone to Savage. L.C. Smith would end up with Marlin. Lefever's doubles were already finished. The collapse wasn't a story about one badly run company. It was an entire craft tradition meeting an economy and a technology that no longer had room for it. When historians talk about what killed the American double gun, the honest answer is a stack of forces arriving together, repeaters, the rise of trap and skeet shooting that favored single-barrel and over-under guns, John Browning's designs, the Depression, and finally a world war, roughly in that order. So Parker did the thing proud companies do last, only when there's no other choice. It looked for a buyer. On June 15, 1934, Parker Brothers was acquired by Remington Arms. On paper, this looked like a rescue. a struggling craft house absorbed into a large, stable arms manufacturer. In practice, it was the beginning of the end of Parker as an institution, and it's worth understanding who was actually buying what. Remington itself had just been bought, in that same year, by the chemical giant DuPont, and the thing Remington seemed to value in Parker was not necessarily the centuries-old craft tradition. It was the things a corporation can put on a balance sheet, a famous high-grade name to put at the top of its shotgun line, and that cartridge business Parker had picked up in the 20s. This is the quiet, brutal heart of the story. Remington bought a reputation. The craft was not part of the sale in any way that could be protected. For a few years, Parkers kept coming, still made in the original Meriden plant, under new ownership. But the center of gravity had already shifted. The future of the Parker name was now decided in a corporate office that belonged to someone else. The family was out. The decisions were external. And around 1937 and 1938, Remington did the thing that severed the name from its home for good. It moved Parker production out of Meriden entirely to its own factory in Ilion, New York. The guns made there were still called Parkers. They carried the name, the grades, the look. But the place that had given the name its meaning, the specific factory, the specific workers, the accumulated muscle memory of hand-fitting that lived in those people and that building, did not make the journey in any complete way. Only a few thousand Parkers, somewhere around 6,000, were built under Remington before the line was done. The name survived. The factory, the workers, and the knowledge did not. Then came the final blow, and it came from exactly the force that had created the company in the first place. War. When the United States entered the Second World War, Remington, like every major arms maker, turned to military production. There was no place in a wartime economy for a hand-fitted luxury shotgun. Parker production stopped. The line was discontinued around 1942, with the last few guns trickling out in the years just after. A company born from the leftover machinery of one war was finally extinguished by the demands of another, and the building? The original Meriden complex passed to the International Silver Company, which used it for storage and shipping, a famous gun factory reduced to a warehouse. Later, part of it housed a maker of wood and metal novelties. The institutional knowledge wasn't transferred or preserved. It simply dispersed, the way knowledge does when the people who hold it are scattered and never replaced. And in 1970, the fire, from the very beginning of the story, finished the physical erasure, taking most of what was left. Records of the company had already been lost to fire as well. The place that made the brand mean something was, by then, almost entirely gone. That should have been the end. A great name, extinguished, fading into the memory of collectors. But this is where the story turns genuinely strange, because the brand had become so strong that it could be reanimated without any of the things that originally created it. In the early 1980s, an American businessman named Tom Skuse decided the world wanted Parker shotguns again. There was just one problem. There was no Parker, no factory, no workers, no tooling, no surviving capacity in America to build a gun to that standard. So he did the only thing left to do. He licensed the Parker name from Remington, which still held the rights to it, and he had the guns built in Japan by a manufacturer called Kodansha. The results were marked Parker reproduction, and in one of the odder footnotes in American gun making, the early guns were stamped Parker reproduction by Winchester, even though Winchester, a completely separate company, had nothing to do with making them. It was an artifact of an import license, a famous American name borrowed onto another famous American name, on guns made overseas. Around 12,000 of these reproductions came into the United States through the late 1980s. And here's the part that should sit uncomfortably with anyone who believes craftsmanship belongs to a place. Many people who handled them judged the Japanese reproductions to be as good as the originals. Some thought they were better. The most faithful Parkers built in 50 years weren't made in Connecticut by Parker, by Americans. They were made in Japan under a borrowed name by a company that had never built a single original. That is what a brand becomes when it outlives its institution. It becomes a license, a thing that can be rented, attached to a factory on the other side of the world, and sold back to the country that lost it. And the company holding that license was not finished repeating history. The Parker trademark, this fragment of 19th century American craft, sat inside Remington. And Remington's own modern story became its own slow motion collapse. The business changed hands, took on the structures that modern ownership brings, and in 2020 the corporate parent, the Remington Outdoor Company, went bankrupt and was broken into pieces, its firearms and ammunition lines scattered to different buyers. The Parker name, already a ghost, wrote a second corporate death decades after the first. A brand that had survived the end of the Civil War market, the rise of the repeater, the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and a factory fire, was now an asset in a bankruptcy, the way a chair or a patent or an old logo is an asset. Meanwhile, the originals only climbed. The finest Parkers became some of the most valuable American sporting guns ever made. That A1 Special, that fine engraved gun, crossing auction blocks at prices that would have stunned the men who fitted them by hand for a few dollars in wages. The side-by-side itself survived only as a boutique pursuit. Today, essentially the only company building an American side-by-side in any volume is a specialist Connecticut maker whose guns start around $13,000, craftsmanship preserved as a luxury for the very few, which is, in a way, exactly where Parker started and exactly where it died. Here is the uncomfortable truth this whole story keeps circling back to. Parker was not destroyed by failure. It was destroyed by winning the wrong race. It built the most perfect version of a thing the market was quietly walking away from, and it kept perfecting it right up until the moment the market was gone. The hand-fitting was the genius. The hand-fitting was also the bill that finally couldn't be paid. Being the best, it turns out, is a description. It is not a defense. And now the original paradox makes sense. A famous name, worth a fortune, attached to a company that hasn't truly existed for generations. The guns are worshipped, precisely because they're extinct, because no factory full of hand-fitting craftsmen will ever make their like again. Military and industrial history isn't only written by generals and contracts, it's written by accountants, owners, and the cheaper machine that arrives at the right moment. If stories like this, the quiet deaths behind familiar names, pull you in, like this video, subscribe, and keep watching. There are more empires gone silent.